Hey everyone, it's Reed. First and foremost, thanks for tuning in. I hope that you will share the show both on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube, wherever you're listening and watching. Let's grow this home front community, guys. This is where the work has to be done here at home, and with it and with you, we will get it done. Please tune in and share this show with your friends, your colleagues, and anybody you think might be interested. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm once again joined by Brendan Ballou, a federal prosecutor who served as special counsel for private equity in the Justice Department's Antitrust Division. Prior to that, he worked in the National Security Division of the Justice Department, where he advised the White House on counterterrorism and other policies. He's a graduate of Columbia University and the Stanford School of Law, and is coming to us from a secure, undisclosed location. Brendan, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so the last time I had you on was almost a couple of years ago when your book, Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America, came out. I think that we're likely to see more of that, and we'll get you back on for that on another day. But let's talk about this. So you wrote an op-ed in the wake of the January 6th pardons, and your concern, as I understand it, is that what this has done is not only put 1,500 people either back on the street, felons out of prison, but it also opens the door for vigilantism and sort of lone wolf retribution, perhaps, and violence. So give us a sense of why you wrote the op-ed and what your main concerns are.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And as I've been saying throughout, I'm trying to talk to as many people as I can, but I really want to emphasize I was a small part of a very large effort. And I think as more people leave the department, leave the U.S. Attorney's Office, I think more people are going to be speaking. And I hope that people who are frankly more central to this story will, have their platform and their opportunity to tell their story. The reason that I wrote the op-ed primarily was about my concern about what the practical effect of the president's pardons of the January 6 rioters will be. In particular, I believe that the effect and probably the purpose, too, of this pardon was to empower vigilantes and militias that are loyal to the president or to this administration, but ultimately unaccountable to the government. This is something that we see happen in a lot of illiberal democracies or outright dictatorships. You can look at the working groups of Argentina that disappeared, thousands of dissidents to sort of less extreme but sort of more pervasive examples like the vigilante groups in Iran that enforce the sort of conservative dress code there. I believe that that is a part of America's future now. We have many hundreds of people who have been quite literally put above the law by the president, and many of whom have expressed enormous loyalty to him. And so just to wrap this up, I will say that this has been, to a certain extent, part of America's past in that, we do have a history of, racial violence through the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, but it's something that most of us have just not experienced in our political lives for decades. And I think that period is coming to an end.
Well, and if you remember going back, 100 years, right, to the Wilson administration during the course of both the lead up to and the duration of World War I, right, there were all sorts of prohibitions placed on especially organized labor and other people who had spoken out on the war. Obviously, Eugene V. Debs, who was a well-known socialist, ran for president, got sent to prison for it. But there were basically, legalized gangs out there. They'd given themselves badges, they'd given themselves guns, and carried out a lot of extrajudicial violence and murder. And so that's one thing I've spoken to a former member of the FBI a few months ago, actually, even before the election, Brennan, and his concern then was that if Trump won, that someone not associated with an organ of the state, whether it's federal, state, local, whatever it was, but just some goon who, picked up an AR-15 would show up at his house, or 9mm, whatever it is. So what does that mean for those people who have stood against this movement for years now? What does that mean for people who are at the top of a list who've been named by, say, a Kash Patel, who's in line to be the FBI director? I think he will be confirmed. What does that mean for otherwise law-abiding, decent First Amendment, preserving Americans?
I think in the immediate aftermath of the pardon, understandably, there was a lot of focus on, sort of the most prominent people that were opposing the administration. And there was some focus on dangers to prosecutors. You were joking about me being in a secure location. This is just an underdecorated room, so don't interpret it that way. I will say, I think that the biggest risk is less to the very prominent people that, publicly oppose the president than it is to the ordinary folks that were part of the minority groups that were targeted by his campaign. So when we're talking about migrants, trans people, and others that really don't have the sort of monetary, the institutional protections that a lot of other folks do, I think, frankly, if you look at what has happened in other countries, those are the groups that are going to be targeted first by these vigilantes unless something happens. And they're the folks that I worry about the most.
Well, and the response, unfortunately, as history has shown us, is it takes a long time for popular sentiment to find its critical mass where enough people who aren't affected, go to the barricades, take to the streets. The initial reaction, and it is the human reaction, is to keep your head down, is to keep your mouth shut, and that's all a part of it too, right? That's the downstream effect, but also the one that a regime like the Trump administration wants, which is people saying, it's safer just not to get involved, it's safer not to see, it's safer not to hear, all of those kinds of self-preservation techniques that, again, we all wish we wouldn't take into account. We all wish we'd walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? We all wish we would have stood up to the Taliban. We all wish that, when the KKK came to our town, we would have said, no more, don't come here. But the truth is that most people, the natural reaction is, I don't want to be harmed. I don't want my family to be harmed.
It's an interesting point. I think there are two things that come to mind in that. One is about sort of my individual experience. I actually was part of government during the first Trump administration. I was a very young lawyer in the National Security Division. And essentially, by bad luck, my office became intimately involved in the travel ban that barred, transit from seven Muslim majority countries. Um, I thought that this was legally and operationally a huge mistake, and a lot of other folks in the intelligence community agreed. And so there was a concerted effort within the bureaucracy to try to stop what we thought was going to be, both legally a huge catastrophe, but also operationally one too. And I bring that up to say that I was actually really surprised to see the depth of resistance to illegal orders in that time. Some people really stood up, and the interesting thing is, it wasn't always the people that you would expect to. Sometimes it was quiet folks or folks that didn't really seem, particularly political, who really showed real professional courage and suffered real professional consequences, but ultimately had an impact. I think the second thing that comes to mind is, um, I agree. Anytime there is a sort of illiberal movement in a country, there's a strong effort to sort of divide and conquer and to have people, not cross that bridge, as it were. I think the advantage that we have as compared to sort of illiberal or anti-democratic movements from, 30, 50, 60 years ago is we have vastly more information and vastly more coverage of what's going on. And a lot of these movements depend not just on rewriting history, but on rewriting the present. And at least at some level, I'm encouraged that it's going to be much harder to do that this time around.
Let me both agree and disagree with you. And then I want to go back to something you said about your first go round in the Trump administration, which is that you can see already that at the FBI headquarters, right, they painted over the big wall with all the positive sentiments about what the Bureau is supposed to stand for. As I understand it, before the storming of the USAID offices, even before Musk and his people arrived, they had started taking down all of the imagery of the different kinds of work that USAID did across the world. Not surprisingly, mostly not Northern European white people. Right. It could be a water project in Africa, a road project in Jordan, whatever it is. But all of that was taken down. And that is a concern of mine, Brendan, is that they are attempting to erase things in real time, as you noted. And I think it's important that somebody be the torchbearer. Somebody say, call it the American Talmud or something, right? Somebody has to preserve the memory of all of those things that have done, and frankly, all of the good works that have been done over the last 60 years by the likes of USAID, or frankly, the everyday civil servant who goes to the Social Security Administration to make sure that, my grandmother got her check. And that's one. And then secondly, as you talked about, there were people who demonstrated a lot of courage in the first Trump administration. And I think we've seen a few examples of that this time. But you can also see, and turn to the FBI for a second. They just handed 8 senior FBI agents or officials their walking papers. They almost canned the guy who's the acting director because he pushed back on them. But they seem to be much more prepared, not surprisingly, to decapitate those senior civil servants or put them on leave, disconnect their badges, their email addresses, so that they're just simply not in a position to be able to push back as much.
Yeah, no, certainly there's an ambition to fire in a way that it didn't seem like there was the last time around. Not to be facetious, but one thing that is true, just that I've seen as a bureaucrat, is they can't fire everybody. And if they're going to keep the operations of the government going, which arguably they may not want to, at least for some parts of the government. But for institutions like the FBI, it is going to be extremely hard to completely decapitate the institutional leadership of that organization. I think you made a good point about sort of having institutional memory on some of these things. From my narrow issue on January 6th, what concerns me is there is now an enormous number of politicians whose careers literally depend on rewriting the history of that day. And so there's going to be an enormous amount of work done to try to forget what happens. And so I think we're going to have to spend a lot of time, not just in the coming months, but the coming years, to memorialize what happened at the Capitol and beyond on January 6th, whether it's getting the evidence from the trials, which is publicly available in the court documents, to institutions that can make those things available to journalists, to researchers, to interested citizens, to finding ways to keep the memory of the day alive. One of the things that concerns me is Congress was required by law to install a plaque honoring the officers that protected Congress that day. Thus far, congressional leadership has refused to install that plaque. I think it would be interesting for somebody to sue Congress to follow the law. Then it would put congressional leadership in the position of having to explain why they refuse to honor the people that literally saved their lives. And so, that's one of a half dozen things that I think are going to need to happen over the coming months, over the coming years, to make sure that history isn't rewritten.
Let me talk about Congress for a second, now that you've brought them up. There's a couple of things. One is, forgive my cynicism here. I don't think they care. I just don't think they do. At least the majority party doesn't care. Let me talk about Kash Patel, who is, a MAGA goon of epic proportions. He's published, the names of people who he would personally take retribution against should he get into a senior position in government. The Democrats seem to have rolled over on his hearing, which I'm not sure why. And Republicans seem to have taken a liking to him, right? They think he's sort of like a good guy, despite all of the appearances on right wing and nationalist podcasts and everything else. But he was asked, will you take retribution? And he said no. In the meantime, over at FBI headquarters, people are saying we want the names of every FBI agent who was involved in the January 6th investigations. So this seems to me to be your point, which is you got one guy who has nothing but bad faith going for him, right? Saying one thing that's clearly a lie, while over at the headquarters at the Hoover Building, they're looking to hunt these guys and gals down.
Yeah. Well, and there's been public reporting about the strong pushback that the institutional FBI leadership has had against that initiative, which is encouraging. Obviously, it's extremely concerning, the political retributions that have happened and that seem like they're going to happen, or at least they're going to try to have happen. One thing that I try to explain to people outside of government is that every policy requires a lot of people to implement it. And the president, the FBI director, senior leadership, contrary to what they say, contrary maybe even to what they believe, can't just order things to happen. You actually have to kind of convince the bureaucracy to do something. And the less popular something is, the harder it is to convince the bureaucracy to do it. And the stronger the institutional culture of a given bureaucracy, the harder it can be to push an unpopular or an illegal order. The FBI has an extremely strong institutional culture, and I think is going to resist this in a way that a lot of departments and agencies just really aren't capable of doing. But I'll also say, for folks on the outside of government, whether it's in the media or people listening to this, people just interested in this issue, I think one of the challenges or one of the opportunities for people to do is to think strategically about for a given illegal or unconstitutional or discriminatory initiative, not just who are the decision makers, but who are the implementers? And how can they be convinced to stop or to slow an illegal initiative? And so I think it's going to be an opportunity for a lot of people to learn a lot about the FBI bureaucracy and see how they can help empower those people that are resisting illegal orders to do so.
Let me ask you about people who are suing, I should say, the Trump administration for various things. There were, I think, 22 Democratic attorneys general who sued Trump over maybe it was the halting of payments. But let me ask you this. So, I run to a federal judge, a district judge, and I say, I would like, Your Honor, I'd like an injunction on this. And that judge says, okay. And the injunction is handed down. In a normal world, the executive branch would stop because they had been ordered by a co-equal branch of government to cease and desist, at least for that moment, until it could be adjudicated further. What happens is my fear is that, you or I could run to a federal judge as is someone was standing and say, this is illegal. Please put an injunction in place. We're going to have a trial, everything else. And the executive branch just says, we don't care.
And that will be a constitutional crisis. And to a certain degree, things like that happened in the first Trump administration at a smaller scale. I remember reading reporting about some ICE agents ignoring federal court orders and so forth. So it's not unprecedented, and it seems like it's plausibly in our future. I think it kind of raises a point about how the rule of law works generally in any country. In that, a federal district court order is probably not going to be particularly persuasive for somebody like Elon Musk. It should be, obviously. He needs to obey the law, but he's the richest man on the planet. He's got a lot of options. But a federal court injunction may constrain folks a little bit lower down on the implementation chain. So whether it's the reported high schoolers or college students that are literally working on Elon Musk's behalf, the sort of federal employees that need to implement some of these policies, or the lawyers that are involved in and other professionals that are involved in some of these programs that might lose their professional licenses if they ignore a federal court order. So I agree. I think it's a very serious risk that federal court orders are going to be ignored. But there are still levers of power that make it hard for at least certain types of people, certain types of important people, to ignore those sorts of orders.
Again, this is my cynicism about the Trump. Maybe it's my realism. Maybe they're the same thing in this case, Brendan. Is that again? You're right. Musk doesn't care. As you know as well as anybody, the judiciary does not have an enforcement mechanism, right? The enforcement mechanism belongs to the executive branch, and so that's my concern. And then you talk about the professional consequences. I mean, that's the other part too that I'm a little bit worried about is that the people who did try and overthrow the 2020 election, I don't know how many of them, but it's not particularly very many have been disbarred, right, in the legal profession. And so that's my concern too, is that as Musk and Trump are running around, breaking things and lighting things on fire, the nature of our system, such as it is, whether or not it's 250 years ago or today, is not meant to catch up with things that fast. And that's my concern is that by the time, what did Mark Twain say? A lie makes its way around the world before the truth gets out of bed. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's close enough for, I think, our purposes.
Yeah. And I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about sort of the possibility for change or opposition here. But one thing that I think is encouraging is that thus far, many of what I would argue are illegal initiatives by this administration so far are not very well thought out, not very well organized. The orders are not particularly well written. And to a certain extent, their success depends on the perception of their own momentum. When you see things actually go into operation that are tremendously unpopular, um, the administration sometimes walks that back. We saw that happen in the last Trump administration a number of times, probably more times, frankly, than a lot of people remember, whether it was rolling back plans to fine undocumented immigrants hundreds of thousands of dollars, or to kick out international students, or the child separation policy, to closing job centers in Appalachia. The list kind of goes on of policies that they walked back because they were poorly conceived, poorly executed, and unpopular. We're seeing that happen even in this administration, even though we're only 3 weeks in. Uh, the rollback of the federal spending freeze, which was obviously pretty disastrously done. So, all of which is to say that even administrations that may have illiberal tendencies do have to be responsive to public opinion, if for no other reason that they need the bureaucracy to implement those policies. And so the less popular those are and the less popular they can be made, the more likely they are that they can be stopped.
No, and I hope for our friends out there, we're doing all our level best to make things that should be unpopular to, not just the people in Washington D.C., but around the country. All right, let me switch gears to national security. How do you see this now as, a national security expert, someone who's got that in their background at DOJ? How how do we ensure that the Elon and the high schoolers, they've been through the secure compartment and information facility at USAID? Are they going to make their way to the tank at the Pentagon? Are they going to make their way to whatever facilities you have at DOJ or at the FBI headquarters and start going through binders of eyes only and, compartmented information? What kind of threat does that represent, not just to the country at large, but to individual Americans?
It's obviously extremely concerning, both for how that information can be used. Elon Musk, for instance, obviously has connections to a lot of governments around the world, is dependent on the Chinese government in a lot of ways for the success of some of his companies. So there's the risk of sort of the immediate risk of how information could be used or misused. I also think that there's the long term danger that this sort of chaos, or this sort of misappropriation has for intelligence work in the long term. A lot of intelligence work is a collaborative effort with other countries, the Five Eyes and others. It wouldn't be irrational for companies to, see continued cooperation as dangerous for their own interests. So I think that there is a serious risk here. I will say, to go back to institutional culture here, though, the reporting, as far as I know, has been that Musk was able to get into a skiff at USAID. I have not heard reporting that he's been able to get into a skiff at the FBI, at the Department of Defense, other parts of the core intelligence community where you have a very strong institutional culture of maintaining secrets. And I think he may, frankly, struggle to do that if those bureaucracies decide or understand that those orders are illegal.
Look, I worked at HHS, I worked at Treasury, I worked at DHS, and sometimes stuff worked and sometimes stuff didn't. I've seen, a lot of dedicated civil servants doing their jobs, and then other people who, because I worked for George W. Bush, like they saw us and they went the other way, right? Like it's like high school, right? Everything resolves to high school. And so I'd be interested to see, how this works out too with these people being offered, if you resign by, was it last week or the end of this week, we'll pay you through September. Other people are, have to come back to the office because they've been remote. All of it seems, Brendan, at its core to be culling the herd. I'd be lying if I said, because I've had several friends who have received these emails. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit concerned that people are going to say, okay, I'll take the buyout, and then they don't get it. And then they're left to, struggle with personal attorneys and suing the government and everything else. That's very Trumpy, to be honest with you. It's also very Musky. They both acted like that before. But to your point, I'm hoping that if that is a legitimate thing, then those people who do take the buyout will get what they've earned or what they've agreed to. But that's again my concern about the erasure of institutions of the rule of law, of tradition, of even decency is going to leave a whole lot of people out in the cold.
I think is a huge concern, and I've been working with various lawyers that are working on exactly this issue about whether or not, that so-called fork in the road offer is going to be honored, whether it can be honored legally. In a lot of ways, this is a repeat of the playbook that Elon Musk executed at Twitter. I think he sent out literally an email with the same subject line offering similar buyouts. And then there was a lot of follow-on litigation about whether those buyouts were going to be honored. So I think it's a very real concern. My friends who are still in government, I talk with them who are thinking about exactly that issue. And I think for a lot of folks, it is going to require follow on litigation. Um, in some ways, the people who are well positioned on some of these things are the folks that were fired for explicitly political reasons. Prosecutors who were fired because they prosecuted the president or rioters or things like that. The government's not allowed to discriminate against you because of your political beliefs or retaliate against you. So those folks, I think, are definitely going to have a very strong case. So I think it's going to be a challenge. I will say it's very easy to cut, or to fire in an administration or in a bureaucracy to sort of bring things down. It's very hard to use that tool to actually start new initiatives, whether for good reasons or for bad. I think you see this literally happening with Twitter, now X. They were enormously successful at cutting down staffing. They have obviously struggled significantly to build a user base or maintain a user base and to add new features. I think something analogous might happen here in government. Last thing is, when you talk about your own experience in government, I think it's a really interesting point, is, I think every person in government needs to decide for themselves how they're going to uphold the constitutional oath that they take on their first day of the job. Every employee has an independent obligation to uphold and defend the Constitution. I will say, at least for me personally, I think that means giving an administration a pretty wide berth in what they're trying to implement. Even if you find a policy disagreeable, enormously disagreeable, I think generally, unelected government employees should defer to our democracy. But I do think that that oath means that they have an independent obligation to stand up when those orders are obviously illegal, corrupt, or discriminatory. And I think that they have a strong basis for doing so.
So, it's funny as we're talking here, I'm just remembering back through my inglorious days in the bureaucracy myself, and I remember sitting on the 8th floor of the HHS building, which someone once called an 8-story basement, and it certainly is. It is ugly on the outside. It is even uglier on the inside, and it's soul sucking, Brendan. And I remember once a friend of mine who we'd been on the 2000 Bush campaign together was up for a job at the White House, and the FBI was doing what they did at the time. I assume they still do it or they outsource it. Asking all these questions about this person. Have you seen this? Have you heard that? And one of the questions, I don't know if they ask anymore, is, have you ever heard this person threaten to overthrow the United States government? Right? Like, I assume that the OPM is currently rewriting that questionnaire. The FBI is being told to rewrite that questionnaire because the answer would be yes in a lot of cases.
Yeah, no, that's that. At least when I took it, that's still on some of the forms. So yes, that's still a question. That's a great point. It'll be interesting to see if it stays on there in a couple of years.
Right. And this I think goes to the whole point too, which is you mentioned offhandedly, you've got Musk running around to different agencies. He's got this passel of, shiny young fascists or proto-fascists with him, and that's my word, not yours. And none of these people are cleared for anything. He's not cleared for anything other than, I assume, whatever contracts he needed. But Trump, of course, can give anybody anything they want. But that's the other part, is just, you know, we need to remember that whether or not it's the United States Constitution or, the federal code as you knew it, these things only matter so long as people believe they matter. The Constitution matters so long as the words printed on it have true meaning, not only to the people in government, but to all of us. And it's not just an old piece of paper in the archives. That's my concern, is that it's just we're in this post truth, post belief, post rule of law era for now. I don't know. That's the other part. Regimes like this, as you mentioned, some other places often sow the seeds of their own destruction, just given the nature of it. You mentioned, how unruly they are, how unwieldy they are, how little attention they pay to detail, and then of course just the internecine battles. The problem is, as I've said many times, is the damage they wreak while they're doing it, and how other people, often innocent, have to contend with that or pick up the pieces after the fact.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend who's a scholar of democracies, and I was asking him about, sort of what are the international comparisons to what we're experiencing now? Because I think a lot of folks, writing about this, their minds sort of immediately run to the USSR, Germany in 1932, et cetera, et cetera. And I was saying it as, what are the other comparisons here? And he made a good point, which is, there are many countries that sort of flirt with illiberalism or even descend into illiberalism for a period of time, but then get themselves out. Poland, I think, is a really good recent example, which had sort of reactionary movement come into power for a number of years. A lot of the same dynamics is what we're seeing now, but to your point, sort of collapsed under the weight of their own corruption, and eventually a movement was able to form to reject that reactionary movement and sort of restore, sort of democratic institutions. To your point about sort of living in a post truth or post meaning time, I think it goes back to something that we were talking about earlier about the need to not let history be rewritten. I was in Chile last year, um, and Chile had an experience with a horrifying dictatorship. Was eventually able to get out of it, and I went to this museum, this Museum of Memory and Human Rights, they call it, and it's a memorial to the sort of atrocities of the dictatorship and the path for escaping it. And it's an enormously moving museum, and there's actually been research talking about how people's opinions of democracy actually change after they go to that specific museum. And I think it's going to be a long-term effort to do the same thing in the U.S., to reaffirm a commitment to democracy and to also making a democracy that actually works for most people. So this is going to be a long-term effort.
Right, and as you noted in your book about the private equity movement, right? So much of what they have done has tended to separate people from their wealth or overtake industries and skeletonize them, which further erodes people's trust that anything matters, which means that you have 15 million people stay home in November. Because what difference does it make anyway? I vote for this person, I vote for that person. I look out my window, my life doesn't change. And that, I think, is our task to everyone listening and watching in the coming weeks, months, and years. And I think, Brendan, from my perspective, we need to, we need to open the aperture. Yes, there are things that are happening every day, and they will happen every week. But if we spend the next 4 years, the next 1,000 days, day by day, with our hair on fire, right? By the time Trump leaves, God willing, we will be exhausted, and that movement that you talked about, like developed in Poland, will take that much longer. Whereas I believe that we need to sow those seeds now, so that when it does come to an end, we've got some green shoots working for us.
I completely agree. I think that the causes of illiberalism in any country are various. You can't just point at cultural grievance or inequality or
Right.
whatever it happens
They're
to
all
be.
homegrown, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but I will say on so many issues on which there is bipartisan consensus, I think the government has really struggled to solve problems for a lot of ordinary people. And on the economic front, for many people, life has gotten a lot harder. Not just over the last 4 years, but over the last 40, 60 years. I agree with you. There's a sort of reactive element to defending democracy, but there's also a proactive element of showing and proving that democracy can actually improve people's lives, and that might be the most important part of all.
Amen to that. All right. Well, listen, Brendan, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for all you were doing and all you will do. Before we let you get out of here, where can everyone find your work?
So my book is Plunder: Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America, and I'm on Twitter as my name, Brendan Ballou, although I tweet very rarely, so I won't be that interesting.
As always, gang, you can find me still on Twitter, but again, rarely on TikTok and on says.us, SEZ.us at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, here at the home front, over on Substack at the home front as well. And please, everybody, go to jointheunion.us, get involved. We are doing that work that Brennan and I were just talking about. Brennan, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for your time.
Everybody else, we'll see you next time.